Today, more than 70 congressional Democrats are calling for President Trump to be removed from office, either through impeachment or by his cabinet invoking the 25th Amendment. More than a quarter of congressional Democrats are questioning Trump's mental fitness after he threatened that Iran's whole civilization will die. And while reaction from sitting Republican lawmakers has been muted, Senator Lisa Murkowski issued a statement saying Trump's threat cannot be excused. MSNL's Michael Schnell is following this for us from Washington, D.C. Also here, Mark McKinnon, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain and creator of The Circus. So, Michael, where are we in this debate over Trump's fitness, and has the ceasefire announcement changed anything?
Yeah, Chris, certainly not for Democrats, right? Beforehand, as you mentioned yesterday, as the president's threats were playing out on Truth Social, we heard from dozens of Democrats who said that the president needed to be removed, whether that be through impeachment, whether that be through the 25th Amendment, both extremely high bars to clear. But just zeroing in on the 25th Amendment first, that would require a majority of the cabinet and the vice president to declare.
Hey there, it's John, and today is a good one. A sustained congressional accountability effort against Trump has been unfolding for years, far deeper than mainstream coverage suggests. The full scope of constitutional action goes beyond the headlines. Most people don't realize just how significant the formal congressional record against Trump has become. This isn't some fleeting political controversy that flared up and faded away like so many other news cycles we've witnessed. What we're actually dealing with here is a meticulously documented pattern of formal constitutional action that spans multiple years, involves numerous separate legislative efforts, and continues to evolve even as we speak. The House of Representatives, operating under its constitutional authority to serve as a check on executive power, has engaged in what can only be described as an unprecedented, sustained campaign of formal accountability measures.
The president unfit for office. And then if the president objected, but the cabinet and the vice president wanted to go through with their belief, it would require at least 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to believe that the president is unfit for office and to have him be removed. An extremely high bar to clear. But yet those threats, those claims and that commentary from Democrats underscores the deep frustrations and concerns that they have with the president's posture and strategy when it comes to Iran. Now, when you talk about the Republican reaction, it's been diametrically different from Democrats. Yesterday, we did see some Democrats some Republicans in the lead up to that 8 p.m. deadline voice concerns with the president's rhetoric, whether that be threatening to take out an entire civilization or some of his more vulgar language that he's used in some of those threats. For example, take Congressman Moran, a Republican. He wrote on X, quote, "So let me be clear, I do not support the destruction of a whole civilization. That is not who we are, and it is not consistent with the principles that have long guided America." And then take a listen to Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, who's very close to President Trump.
That would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Think about the historical weight of what we're discussing. Impeachment isn't something Congress takes lightly or reaches for casually. The framers of the Constitution deliberately designed this mechanism to be an extraordinary tool reserved for the most serious circumstances, precisely because they understood the destabilizing effect that frequent impeachment efforts could have on the stability of the executive branch. Yet here we are witnessing repeated formal actions that suggest something fundamentally different about the nature of presidential accountability in our current era. This sustained pattern tells us volumes about the depth of congressional concern and the seriousness with which lawmakers view the conduct that's been documented. When you strip away all the political rhetoric and media commentary, what remains is a genuine constitutional record that's been building piece by piece.
I am hoping and praying that President Trump this really is bluster. I do not want to see us start blowing up civilian infrastructure. I do not want to see that. We are not at war with the Iranian people.
Now, Chris, we're not hearing any of that similar rhetoric today from Republicans. The main message that folks are saying is that they're happy with the ceasefire. They hope it holds. They hope that progress can be made for a diplomatic solution within the next 2 weeks, and that this is how President Trump operates, that he is a deal maker, and this was his strategy all along. So certainly a different vibe from yesterday to today, but really high stakes 2 weeks. We'll have to see how that plays out and keep an eye on how Republicans react at every twist and turn.
Yeah. So, Mark, Connecticut Democratic Congressman John Larson has filed articles of impeachment against Trump on top of all these calls for the 25th Amendment. But do you think it's politically useful for Democrats to call for things they can't deliver?
Not really. This is just sort of more of what we've heard for ever since Trump was elected from Democrats. But I do think, and it's not until we start hearing that same sort of
over an extended timeline. Each formal action, each resolution, each article of impeachment adds another layer to this documented history. And what's particularly striking about this pattern is that it hasn't been a single unified effort driven by one group of lawmakers or one particular set of allegations. Instead, we're seeing multiple separate initiatives launched by different representatives at different times, all addressing different aspects of presidential conduct while converging on the same fundamental conclusion about the need for removal from office. The formal impeachment resolution that passed the House represents one of the most concrete constitutional actions Congress can take against a sitting president. This wasn't some symbolic gesture designed to make a political point. This was the House of Representatives
language and those sort of proposals from Republicans that anybody should take it seriously. And as mentioned by your correspondent, the bar is so high. The reason that Trump has the loyalists in the cabinet that he does is so that the 25th Amendment would never be invoked. So it never will. The broader implications, I think, are that the president is using the language of terrorists and religious fanatics now. So on a global, as people around the globe and foreign leaders look to our country, the president has put himself on the level of terrorists and fundamentalist jihadists. So I just think diplomatically it puts the president and our country in a very difficult place going forward, because now we've just put ourselves in a very different level diplomatically on the world stage.
There's also Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth arguing that this ceasefire never would have happened, Mark, if Trump hadn't used the rhetoric that he has. Here's that.
Formally invoking its constitutional authority to charge the president with high crimes and misdemeanors, using the precise language the framers embedded in the Constitution to describe offenses serious enough to warrant removal from office. The resolution explicitly stated that Trump warranted removal, leaving no ambiguity about the House's determination regarding the severity of the conduct in question. What makes this particularly significant is understanding that each formal impeachment vote leaves a permanent mark on American constitutional history. Every time the House formally votes to impeach, regardless of what happens afterward in the Senate, that moment becomes part of the permanent congressional record. Future historians, legal scholars, and citizens studying this period will find documented evidence that a majority of elected representatives determined at that specific moment.
That's why they came to the table. He ultimately said, we can take it all from you. Your ability to export energy will be taken away. And the United States military has the ability to strike those things with impunity. That type of threat is what brought them to the place where they effectively say, hey, okay, we want to cut this deal.
They had also simultaneously said that, let me ask you, does Trump, the successful negotiator, as an argument, hold up to the facts with the American people who will be voting, not for Donald Trump, but for Republicans who, whether they support him or not, have not been vocal about lack of support?
Well, I think that what they're going to look at is the results. And Hegseth's language is just laughable. What brought the Iranians to the table was they got exactly what they want. I mean, they're negotiating their 10-point proposal now. And things are much better for them now than they were before the start of the conflict. So I think ultimately the box that Republicans are going to be in is that they're going to have to defend this in the midterms and going forward. And I just think that no matter how much Hegseth and the Trump tries to spin this as some sort of advantage or a win for the United States, it's just laughable on his face when you look at the fact that Iran is just by the facts in a better place today than they were before.
That presidential conduct had crossed the constitutional threshold requiring removal. That historical weight doesn't dissipate simply because the Senate ultimately failed to convict. But what truly transforms this from a single dramatic event into a sustained pattern of accountability is what happened next. Almost a year after that initial impeachment resolution, another representative stepped forward to introduce 7 entirely separate articles of impeachment. This wasn't just repeating earlier efforts or recycling old allegations. These were new articles addressing different aspects of presidential conduct, expanding the formal record in significant ways. The timing alone tells us something important about the persistence of congressional concern. Rather than moving on to other legislative priorities after the initial effort didn't produce Senate conviction, lawmakers continued developing new formal actions addressing ongoing concerns. Think about the political calculus involved in introducing additional articles of impeachment after earlier efforts haven't succeeded. Every lawmaker who puts their name on new impeachment articles knows they're taking a stand that carries both political risks and potential consequences. Some constituents will applaud the commitment to accountability, while others will view it as political overreach. Yet, despite these risks, the pattern of additional article introductions continues, suggesting that the underlying concerns are substantial enough to warrant repeated formal action even in the face of an uncertain outcome in the Senate. The broader political environment surrounding these formal congressional actions has been equally significant. Beyond the official resolutions and articles, there's been an organized public pressure campaign that's gathered documented statements from lawmakers and advocacy organizations explicitly calling for Trump's removal through any of the 3 constitutional pathways available. This coordinated effort has brought together voices from across the political spectrum, all united around the shared goal of seeing the president leave office before the natural conclusion of his term. Each of these 3 pathways represents a distinct constitutional mechanism with its own specific requirements and decision makers. Resignation would require Trump himself to make the voluntary choice to leave office, a personal and political decision that rests entirely within his own control. Impeachment and conviction requires the full congressional process we've already discussed, with the House impeaching and the Senate ultimately deciding whether to convict and remove. And the 25th Amendment provides a separate mechanism where the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can declare the president unable to discharge his duties, triggering a complex constitutional process that could lead to removal. When public statements and advocacy efforts specifically reference all 3 pathways together, they're essentially making a strategic choice to keep all options on the table, rather than betting everything on any single mechanism. This comprehensive approach reflects a practical understanding that achieving removal through any constitutional avenue is challenging. So keeping pressure across all available channels maximizes the chances that at least one pathway might ultimately succeed. It's not claiming that any particular mechanism has already succeeded or is guaranteed to work. Rather, it's sustaining broad pressure while working through each specific constitutional process as circumstances allow. The documented support from more than 100 House Democrats and various Senate figures represents genuine, significant political mobilization that deserves careful attention. When you have that many elected officials publicly aligning around the shared goal of presidential removal, even if they're pursuing that goal through different specific mechanisms or different specific timelines, that kind of broad political alignment matters enormously, even if it doesn't immediately produce successful removal. It shapes the broader political environment that the administration has to navigate every single day. The practical implications of sustained, widespread congressional pressure, even when it doesn't immediately produce successful removal, can influence everything about how the presidency functions. Other lawmakers who might have been inclined to cooperate more closely with the administration may become more cautious when they see this level of formal opposition. The broader public perception of the administration's legitimacy and stability inevitably shifts when substantial numbers of elected representatives are on record calling for removal. And the administration itself has to allocate attention and resources to managing these ongoing accountability efforts rather than focusing exclusively on governing priorities. Now let's talk about that specific language about stepping down, because understanding exactly what this does and doesn't represent matters enormously for accurately grasping the full story. Step down isn't a formal legal term with specific constitutional meaning the way impeachment or 25th Amendment action are. It's political language that describes the broader goal these various pressure campaigns are working toward, Trump leaving office through whichever specific legitimate mechanism actually succeeds in accomplishing that outcome. When headlines frame this as Congress demanding Trump step down after impeachment papers drop, they're accurately capturing genuine political pressure and genuine formal impeachment activity while compressing multiple distinct accountability threads into language that makes it sound like one unified demand. The difference between understanding this as a unified demand versus a complex pattern of multiple separate actions might seem subtle, but it actually matters enormously for understanding how American constitutional governance operates in practice. The reality is that impeachment, 25th Amendment action, and resignation all operate through completely distinct mechanisms with different decision makers and different constitutional requirements. They're not interchangeable parts of some single unified process. Understanding that these are separate tools that get deployed in different circumstances helps clarify what's actually happening in Washington. When you step back and look at the full picture, what emerges is a documented pattern that's genuinely significant in American constitutional history. You've got a formal House impeachment resolution that explicitly stated Trump warranted removal from office. You've got separate additional articles introduced nearly a year later, expanding the formal record. You've got compiled public statements from lawmakers and advocacy groups explicitly calling for removal through whatever constitutional pathway proves viable. And you've got reported claims of over 100 House Democrats and Senate figures actively pressing for removal through various mechanisms. This represents genuine, sustained political and formal congressional pressure, even without any single unified legal order actually forcing Trump's removal. The cumulative weight of all these separate actions creates a documented historical record that will shape how this presidency is evaluated for generations to come. Each additional article, each additional lawmaker publicly signing on to removal statements, each additional advocacy organization adding their voice builds toward a comprehensive documented record. Even if that record never produces the 2/3 Senate majority needed for actual removal, it still shapes how this presidency gets remembered and evaluated by future generations. Let's dig deeper into why formal House impeachment matters so much, even without a subsequent successful Senate conviction. Every single formal impeachment vote becomes a permanent part of American constitutional history. A documented moment when a majority of the House formally determined a sitting president's conduct rose to the level of an impeachable offense. That historical weight doesn't disappear if the Senate ultimately doesn't convict. It remains a formal, documented statement about how a majority of elected representatives viewed that specific conduct at that specific moment in time. The introduction of additional articles by different lawmakers over time serves a crucial purpose in building this historical record. Each new set of articles typically addresses specific, distinct conduct or allegations that have emerged since earlier efforts. These aren't simply repeating earlier efforts, they're building an expanding, cumulative formal record, addressing an evolving set of concerns as new developments continued emerging. That cumulative pattern matters enormously for understanding the broader trajectory here. Rather than one single impeachment effort rising and falling, you're seeing a sustained, evolving accountability effort with different lawmakers contributing different specific articles, addressing different specific concerns as they arise. The historical significance of this pattern extends beyond just Trump's specific situation. Every time Congress formally moves to impeach, whether or not conviction ultimately follows, that action establishes documented historical precedent about what kind of presidential conduct a sitting Congress considered serious enough to warrant that extraordinary constitutional response. Future historians, legal scholars, and even future Congresses will look back at this specific pattern of repeated formal action when evaluating both Trump's specific presidency and the broader question of how effectively impeachment functions as an accountability tool in modern American politics. The practical political calculation behind why lawmakers choose to publicly align with removal calls, even understanding that actual successful removal remains genuinely difficult to achieve given the high Senate conviction threshold, reveals important dynamics about how political accountability operates in practice. Publicly supporting removal efforts, even unsuccessful ones, represents a clear political statement, signaling to constituents and to history exactly where that specific lawmaker stood on questions of presidential accountability during this specific period. That documented record can shape future elections, future political careers, and future historical assessments, regardless of whether Trump himself actually leaves office. The Senate conviction threshold of 2/3 represents an extraordinarily high bar that requires substantial bipartisan agreement in an era where party line voting tends to dominate most significant congressional decisions. The founders specifically designed that high threshold because they wanted removing a president to require overwhelming cross-partisan consensus, not simply a majority party's preference. So even with genuinely substantial documented pressure, over 100 lawmakers, multiple formal resolutions, ongoing advocacy campaigns, actually clearing that 2/3 Senate threshold requires a level of bipartisan agreement that simply hasn't materialized based on what's been documented so far. This gap between substantial pressure and the extraordinarily high bar required for actual conviction helps explain why this pattern keeps recurring without producing final resolution. Lawmakers keep documenting their positions and building the formal record, while the specific mathematical threshold for actual removal remains genuinely difficult to reach. The sustained nature of the effort itself, the fact that lawmakers keep coming back to these issues rather than letting them fade after initial unsuccessful efforts, tells us something significant about how deep the underlying concerns actually run. As we continue watching these developments unfold, both the formal impeachment resolutions and the additional articles remain part of the permanent congressional record, with any further House votes or subsequent Senate action representing the genuine next constitutional steps in each specific process. And the broader political pressure campaign involving resignation calls, impeachment advocacy, and 25th Amendment discussion likely continues developing based on whatever specific political and legal developments emerge throughout the remainder of Trump's time in office. This is a story that's still being written even as we speak. Look, when you strip away all the political commentary and media framing, here's what actually happened. The House formally voted to impeach Trump, explicitly stating he warranted removal from office. A representative separately introduced additional articles of impeachment, expanding the formal record. And documented public pressure, including reported support from over 100 lawmakers, has explicitly called for his removal through resignation, impeachment, or 25th Amendment action. That's not a rumor. That's not some single unified step-down order. That's the real, documented, ongoing pattern of formal and political pressure that keeps resurfacing and continues building its own historical record with each passing month. Understanding this story accurately, rather than through compressed, exaggerated headline framing, matters because sustained congressional pressure, even without immediate successful removal, genuinely shapes the broader political environment and legitimacy questions surrounding any presidency. The cumulative weight created over time through additional articles, additional lawmakers publicly signing on to removal statements, and additional advocacy organizations adding their voices builds toward a more comprehensive documented historical record that will shape how this entire period gets evaluated by future generations studying this specific moment in American political history. So keep your eyes open, because this pattern of formal impeachment activity and broader removal pressure remains genuinely significant and far from resolved. This now marks several distinct impeachment and cabinet accountability stories that have been documented and covered extensively. Each new development adds another layer to an already substantial record, And the sustained nature of this congressional engagement suggests we haven't seen the final chapter of this story yet. Next time you see a headline about impeachment papers dropping and Congress demanding removal, it's worth remembering that the real documented reality of multiple separate formal resolutions, ongoing new article filings, and sustained broad political pressure campaigns represents something genuinely more substantial than any single compressed headline moment could fully capture. The pattern that's been established through years of sustained congressional accountability activity, with all its multiple separate actions and documented concerns, is historically significant, regardless of whether it ever produces the two-thirds Senate majority needed for actual removal. It's easy to see a headline about Congress demanding Trump step down and assume some single dramatic event just happened. But the real documented reality, multiple separate formal resolutions, ongoing new article filings, and sustained broad political pressure campaigns represents a genuinely significant, sustained accountability story, stretching across years rather than one single compressed dramatic moment. That's really the bigger picture underneath all of this. Not one single unified demand, but a genuine, sustained pattern of formal congressional action and broader political pressure continuing to develop and expand, reflecting real documented concern from a substantial number of elected officials and advocacy organizations. And honestly, that's the part that should stick with you long after you finish reading this. It's easy to see a headline about impeachment papers dropping and Congress demanding removal and treat it as one isolated dramatic news cycle. But the confirmed reality here, multiple separate formal resolutions and article filings, sustained broad political pressure spanning years, is genuinely more significant and honestly more historically consequential than any single compressed headline moment could ever fully capture. So next time you see a headline compressing years of sustained congressional accountability activity into one single dramatic demand, take a moment to remember the fuller picture. Formal resolutions, individual article filings, and broad political pressure campaigns, all representing genuine, sustained, documented concern rather than one single isolated moment of political drama. The constitutional mechanisms designed by the founders continue functioning as intended, providing multiple pathways for congressional accountability, even when any single mechanism faces significant obstacles to success. This ongoing pattern of formal action represents American constitutional governance operating exactly as designed, with the legislative branch exercising its checks and balances against executive power through whatever legitimate mechanisms remain available. The sustained nature of this effort, the persistence of lawmakers continuing to pursue accountability through formal constitutional channels, and the growing documented record all testify to the resilience of American constitutional institutions, even amid significant political polarization. What we're witnessing isn't political theater or symbolic gesture. It's the actual functioning of constitutional governance, with elected representatives documenting their concerns through formal mechanisms designed specifically for this purpose. The historical record being built through these actions will serve as a crucial resource for future generations seeking to understand how American democracy navigated this challenging period and how constitutional accountability mechanisms operated in practice. Understanding that distinction helps separate the real, substantial, underlying story from any exaggerated single event framing. The sustained pattern of formal impeachment resolutions, additional articles, and coordinated pressure reflects deep and persistent concern about presidential accountability. Lawmakers keep documenting it, not letting it fade, which signals that the engagement is genuinely significant and far from resolved.